Hello, my name is Robert Washburn, and I am part of the James Cockburn Society. I'm here with Rob Franklin, who is my associate in the James Cockburn Society. Welcome, James.
Thank you.
James Cockburn Day is going to be different this year. Usually the James Cockburn Society participates in a weekend full of local activities to help raise awareness about the Honourable James Cockburn, our father of Confederation and the first Speaker of the House of Commons. Its purpose is also to increase people's knowledge of local history in Northumberland County. For many years, Rob Franklin has portrayed Cockburn in several plays at Victoria Hall and the Cobourg Museum. But due to the pandemic, the Society has decided not to do a performance this year. Instead, we would like to facilitate a conversation about local history. In recent weeks, news reports of protests by Black Lives Matter and Indigenous groups question whether statues of historical significance of Canadian figures like Sir John A. Macdonald or Egerton Ryerson should be removed. Locally, a statue of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Williams in front of Port Hope Town Hall has created a stir. These groups and others challenge our notions surrounding the records of these people who are aggrandized through statues, public monuments, and other honors. The role of these people in the genocide of Indigenous peoples tests the standards by which we, as a society, see the contributions of Canada's formation. This shines a light on our views of people in the past, so we're going to have a discussion about how we see historical figures using our very own James Cockburn and other examples. We're calling it the Honourable James Cockburn, Warts and all, seeing the humanity in people from our past. We hope it will give you some food for thought. Rob, I'm going to let you start. How about with a bit of background about James Cockburn?
Sure. Well, James Cockburn was born just south of the Scottish border in Britain, Warwick-on-Tweed, February the 13th, 1819. So he's just a little over 200 years old. He came with his family across by boat, originally to Montreal in 1832, and became a Canadian citizen, went to school here in Toronto, took his law degree there, and then came back to here to Cobourg to work initially as a solicitor, and then he entered into politics, originally locally here in the town of Cobourg as a local councillor, as well as town solicitor at some points as well. He then took on the role as a reform candidate at the last minute and was elected here locally and joined what we would consider now to be provincial politics at that point when they met in Toronto. For that point was Canada West, before it became Ontario. He became Solicitor General at that point. Again, he was a strong lawyer. He had moved from being a reformer to a conservative, working with John A. Macdonald before he was Sir John A. And then through that role was involved in the 1864 Quebec Conference, which formed the basis of what became Confederation here for the Dominion of Canada, was involved in writing those documents, and became the first Speaker of the House of Commons in that first Parliament with Sir John A. Macdonald. He then unfortunately passed away in 1883 after leaving politics and becoming a public servant, where he was compiling the statutes of all of the provinces into one master law document, which, as I understand, talking to some lawyers, is still referenced more in Ottawa, but it's still a legal document today.
So what do you find makes James Cockburn an interesting individual, and why did you take an interest in him?
Local history speaks to me. In my role as a town planner during the day, I think all town planners have an interest in history. Why are streets named the way they are? Why do neighborhoods get named the way they do? Where do park names come from? Where were the businesses? Where was the industry? Where were the creeks for the harbors? Who were the important families and characters? Because maybe their house still exists on an important street corner and we want to protect that. Things like that. So my interest went a little over the top. I think a costumed historical character in a historic place like his office here in Victoria Hall tells stories that you can't read about in books. When you can come in and talk to a historical character and learn about that story, come and see his a coal-fired stove that would have heated all of the various offices here in Victoria Hall, and had the kids and families come in and see these things, tourists or local citizens. Helps tell the story of what history was about.
Now, when we were talking earlier, it was really interesting what you were saying, because you talked very glowingly of James Cockburn, but that's not always been the case. And in fact, I know you and I, when we do our research, we've found out that he really had a very tragic life in some aspects, and it wasn't all sunshine and roses that a brief biography would tell us.
No, exactly. I mean, with losing his father, as soon as they came to Canada, he contracted, I believe it was Asiatic cholera on the boat ride over. He died in Montreal Harbor in, whether it was quarantine or at the docks thereafter. And then his mother, as a single mother, took him and his brothers and sister to Toronto, and worked, from what we can tell from our research, in a girls' school as a teacher. So to think, to come from a single mother's background in those days, to then get your law degree and become a father of Confederation, I think speaks to the work ethic that he had. But it was very tragic. I mean, to lose his dad right away, to lose his wife quite young after 3 children, and then to almost shortly thereafter, I think it was only a year or 2 later, then also lost his mother. And they talk about a massive funeral here in Victoria, in Cobourg, across from Victoria Park at the Anglican Church, that there was thousands came from all around Lake Ontario. So again, she must have been well known to get that kind of turnout for her passing.
But also, too, I know that, from my experience, my first encounter with James Cockburn was over a cairn that exists in the Cobourg Conservation Area, and an area that was historically known as James Cockburn Park, but then became Rotary Park, and then had some other names, but had been completely overgrown. And this was back in 1997. And it was fascinating for me to discover this guy. Here's this cairn that honors that Queen Elizabeth came and dedicated in the 1970s. And it talks about James Cockburn Park. And I was like, who is this guy? And why do we not know more about him if we live in Cobourg? And so it's really interesting how, both of us have sort of come upon him in a very accidental way. And yet I think sometimes, and I've thought this often, if it was somewhere else, say in the United States or maybe in Britain, he would have been a huge figure locally, because he was, of course, our father of Confederation. He was there at the Quebec Conference, helped negotiate the deal, which was the foundation for Confederation. And yet at the same time became the first Speaker of the House of Commons, which again is a historic honor. And yet we never hear of him. There's no statues of him anywhere. There's no monuments to him. And in fact, historians have not been very kind to him in the same breath. I wonder how you feel about that.
Well, it's always been somewhat challenging. I mean, through our research, working here in Victoria Hall, I knew the office was here. It was interesting, and I wanted to know more about the guy. I know about the cairn, having worked previously for the Conservation Authority, and was involved with the cairn cleanup back in the late 90s when I worked for that office prior to coming here to the town of Cobourg. And I mean, I'm originally from Peterborough, so everybody knows about Peter Robinson and the Irish settlers who came and settled Peterborough and Douro Township and places like that. But you come to Cobourg and people they might know about the cairn, they might know the name, but very challenging. And here it is, as you say, one of the fathers of Confederation, and there isn't a flag. We do have a new plaque out front of Victoria Hall that Parks Canada did as part of Canada 150. As you and I did our research, we found out that in 1967, so 53 years ago, that his grave site was so overgrown that the family and the federal government contributed to creating a whole new gravestone at his grave site in Toronto, in the cemetery there. So to think that like some of the other family stones that are there that are just so old and are in rougher shape. They're limestone, so things are deteriorating somewhat. Um, Nice to know that plaque is still there, that permanent monument. Your grave site kind of is that final resting place, whereas we want to bring some more of that story to life here in Cobourg so that people do know when they go by the cairn, when they're walking through Cobourg Conservation Area, James Cockburn Park, or as they're here in Victoria Hall and they see the picture or the office is open and they poke their heads in and see this law office that I'm sitting in here today, and they want to know a bit more about, well, who is this guy? Things in comic book that was done up as well. I mean, to help tell that story to people. Because if we lose our stories, we're no different than any other place. And it's the stories that make a place different.
It's interesting too, because in 1980, Queen's University history professor Donald Swainson wrote a scathing article in an academic journal, called Ontario History, entitled "Forgotten Men Revisited: Some Notes on the Career of the Honourable James Cockburn, a Deservedly Neglected Father of Confederation." And he really did a hatchet job on it. And I believe he also came at the same time and spoke to the local historical society on the same topic. And then one of the things that he's very critical of Cockburn, and I won't go into all the details, but it's a couple of things that he points out is that, one, he spent a career in financial difficulty, and he was always scrambling for money. He was in debt. He was looking for patronage appointments, ways to finance things. He was a very successful lawyer with Darcy Bolton when he started his law practice, but once he got into national and provincial politics, it became harder. And of course, in those days, you didn't get a salary for being a politician. You had to be wealthy on your own, and because of a lot of the reform movement, it wasn't just the elite that were getting the elected. It was also now lawyers and doctors and businessmen that were also being elected. So you had to have money, and his law practice didn't do well. I wonder, when historians start to focus on these kinds of things, does it demonstrate to us that there's sort of a hierarchy of historic figures? It's almost like there are those who deserve our time, and there's like those who do not. And maybe James Cockburn falls into the second category because he didn't do well financially. He didn't speak a lot in the House, so there's not a lot of records. He was not a prolific writer of letters, or we don't have documents for him. So we really don't have anything that we can sort of attribute to him. Therefore, de facto, he's not important. I just wonder what you thought about that.
Well, and that's been the hardest thing, that if your importance is by how many words you wrote or how much paper there is about you, you can see why people like Sir John A. or George Brown, who owned a newspaper, would have lots known about them, that they were grandiose speakers, that they could come out and have a crowd of thousands of people come out just to hear them speak. We know that there was large crowds because we've been able to find in the newspaper records, when James came and spoke about certain things, successes of things like the Cobourg Harbor, the railway, that there were crowds of hundreds of people out here on George and King Streets here in downtown Cobourg, that you had firemen holding torches up and down George Street to the train station with wagons late in the evening because he's arrived back from Ottawa where a bill has been passed. That doesn't happen now. I mean, when our local politicians come back and say, oh, they come out for a check signing and it is very important today as then, but we do it a little bit differently. We don't have firemen holding torches. We do a photo op out in front of the hospital or something like that, where it's just as important today when we have those success stories, but you don't have the same kinds of crowds that you did then. Now, maybe that's the modern information age, and people read about it in social media or look at a post, whereas in those days, you didn't have other things to do. So you would come out late in the evening in your Sunday best and cheer that business could be made here in this community.
Well, it almost seems like historians want to create heroes, and then there's everybody else, and those heroes get elevated in our culture. I mean, their stories become mythic or legendary, and then these people become elevated within our society, and they're meant to inspire us and to engender patriotism or maybe stimulate our nationalism, and they make us feel proud to be Canadian. But then the question becomes, Rob, I wonder, so what happens when the shine wears off? And I wonder if that's starting to happen now, as we talked about in the introduction.
Well, with some of our historical characters, people don't always know why that they're important and what they contributed to society, which is where I think Cobourg has been forgotten about. People don't know what he did as first speaker, uh, um, how important that role was then, how important that role is today, and how the politics of the government of Canada work. Um, if you believe in the democratic system and how things are done here. But we elevate heroes today. Unfortunately, now instead of politicians as much, it's things like sports figures or singers or movie actors. And unfortunately, today, as we seem to be doing with historical characters, as soon as they make a mistake, they get trashed just the same, unfortunately, for any host of reasons. And then they get forgotten about, or they lose their contract sponsorships, or these kinds of things. And you see it happening left and right in the current society because in this information age, we're so quick to blame or find fault.
Well, it's interesting because, I remember in high school in the 1970s learning about Sir John A. And the teacher kept mentioning about his drinking, and he would repeat the fact that he would come into the House of Commons drunk. And this always bugged me, and it even does today. American historic figures, they cut down cherry trees and did not lie, or they crossed rivers standing brazenly on the bows of boats like George Washington. But,
Holding the flag.
but they were never mentioned that they were drunk, and it always made me mad. But today, it's much more serious. I mean, we're talking now about historic figures. There's a real movement of the last few months where statues are being torn down and thrown into rivers, and people are defacing statues, as we saw this with Sir John A. recently and with Edgerton Ryerson. And there's been, as I mentioned in the introduction, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Williams in Port Hope. There's been debate about, should that stay where it is? And I guess the question becomes one of what's the role then of statues in terms of history? And I wondered what you thought about that.
I think a statue becomes a focal point then to tell the story. We don't have a statue or a plaque. Well, we do have a plaque out in front of Victoria Hall, a national monument plaque. We don't have a statue for James. We have his law office. That's what was seen was important to help tell the story, both of James, of Cobourg in those times, 1850 to 1880, and to help tell the story of Victoria Hall here in this law office. So we don't have a statue to deface or move or change. Unfortunately, what happens is that statue becomes the focal point of the negative story, and the positive story gets missed. Conversely, all we've told in the past has been the positive story. There's at least three sides to every story. Tell the full story. As we understand more, as more facts come out from looking at historical documents, historical records, as new diaries come to light, as more research is done, tell all the story. So modify the story. Put it in an appendix. Expand on that, warts and all.
It's interesting. I think statues are put up with a purpose, and I think that they show who has power and they're a reflection of a particular time in history. And we care about them because they are a physical manifestation of ourselves and our past. So statues, though, I don't think are history. Statues are not history. They have an evolving significance, and they stand in public spaces with the consent of people. And when they're too painful of a reminder of the past, then maybe they need to come down, or they need to be put somewhere else, and they need to be moved, because just like they are symbols of a particular time, they're symbolic of our time and how maybe we're having changing views, and they become part of an ongoing discussion. And it's then, once we start to do this, that I think the real hard work of reckoning that what how do I say this? I think it's the hard work of reckoning with that difficult history that has to take place. So I think they have a real purpose right now. And um, I think it's really important that we take this moment, capitalize on this moment to say, look, let's have these hard discussions, let's have these hard talks, and start to really grapple with our history, because it's not as simple or as straightforward as it has been in the past.
Exactly. And that's why I think maybe there needs to be multiple plaques or, again, to expand that story, to tell more about um, what these historical characters did, the positive as well as maybe the not so positive things that they were part of in their day. Somewhat challenging to look at 21st century lenses on 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century characters. They can't change history. The people are who they were. They're just as human as we are, whether we drink or not. Kennedy, JFK, they talk stories about him as being a womanizer, but also, what great things he did as a president of the United States. We have stories of Sir John A. and being a drunkard, and that every bar, pub in Kingston should have a plaque out front that Sir John A. drank it. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it's not just humorous. It's about um, telling that story.
And I think too, it's to recognize also that the significance of these things, they're symbolic. They're not the history itself. They're symbols of it. So if they're a symbol, then we can look at that symbol and we can reinterpret it through lenses as they change in our time. And I think history has a responsibility to go back and to revisit. And as new information comes forward and as other voices get heard, then we get to listen to those voices. I always think of it in terms of James Cockburn, how we sort of had to do the inverse. There was nothing, and we had to go out and find it. And as we found it, it wasn't always very positive about him. And then it's only been through a lot of research and a lot of effort that you and I have discovered all these positives about him. And as you were talking about earlier, it's sort of been an inverse thing. And I think that is an example. It can go both ways. And so what I like to think about, though, is that it shows us the humanity of our historic figures. And that once we start to see them as human beings, then it opens up a whole new world of different people who have been forgotten. And now we can suddenly bring them forward. And if they're not perfect, it's going to be okay, because what we can do is we can say, okay, they weren't perfect, but here's how they made a positive contribution. And then here's something else. But what we don't want to do, and I think this is the hard part, is we don't want to create and lower or discriminate against any particular group or any one group. That we have to weave that all together and see it as much as we can and reconcile all of that. And that's the hard work I was talking about earlier.
Very, very much so. And whether it be as part of First Nations or other cultural background people who feel that these historical characters did something to their ancestors or to their land or these other kinds of things. As part of Truth and Reconciliation, both to our First Nations and the Métis, as part of that whole evolving story, as we learn more and can respect and share and understand, it's vital that as you say, I mean, maybe the statue is part of the focal point for those stories for some of these characters. Other statues, maybe not so much because they didn't have that kind of impact, but to tell those stories, but if they're hurtful or damaging, when you look at a statue, as you say, maybe it's time to shift it, uh, lower it down to show that these are not necessarily only heroes. These were men and women of our past. You can't change the history, but you can try to understand the history. And I think getting rid of the statues, then you forget history, and we don't want to do that.
And two, the inverse is equally true. I think that we start to, through humanizing these people, we get to go out and look at other people who may have been put aside or forgotten, and we get to raise those people up, and they become part of our cultural conversation about historic figures. And I think that reflects the kind of work that you and I have been doing for well over a decade. Trying to bring people's awareness through our plays and through our presentations and through the educational work that we do to help people understand somebody who's been forgotten. And while he had a very tragic life and he faced great difficulties and great challenges. Um, he still made a contribution to this country, and where does that fit into the larger puzzle, and how is that significant? And we struggle with it. Rob, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks very much, Rob.